some seminar review forms. Don't fill them out until you hear me speak, though, because I want to change them. He also wants to say a few words, so I'm going to just pause for a minute while he gets those all passed out. Dave, you want me to do that while you... I just got the connection, by the way, between David Hershey and the Hershey bars that are sitting on the tables. I don't know if he did that on purpose or
My father taught me that. He was president of JC's for Ohio, and he would hand out Hershey Kisses as he would go around. And that was kind of also something I used when I was trying to meet girls in high school. So I just wanted to introduce myself. Dave Hershey. I am with Weaver Commercial Contractor as their Director of Business Development, but I also am the company representative for BGW for Ohio, West Virginia, and Western PA. And anything you need at any time, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to help you. So this nice green piece of paper here, take a look at that, and you can go ahead and start filling out some of the information and work your way through that. We'd really like to get your input at the end of the day on what you thought, what you liked, what you didn't like, what we could do better, because we just want to make these as profitable for you as we possibly can. Okay, thanks.
Okay, as Matt indicated to you, my name is Don Mahoney. I am an architect. For those of you that have worked with architects, I will start off apologizing to you for being an architect. I'm sorry. Sometimes that can be a frustrating experience because architects know that this process of getting facilities built, designed and built, is really not about you, it's all about me. That's the way we're trained. That's the way architects are trained from the early onset of school, that architecture is one of the great arts, and if you're practicing architecture properly, you're creating what would be termed timeless architecture. So architecture that's going to be built right, that's going to be designed right, that's going to stand the test of time. And then, you really can't blame professors for trying to inculcate their students with that sort of philosophy, but the reality of it is that in the field that I practice, which is now ministry-based design, I spent 20 years doing performing arts work, and 17 years ago made a switch to do ministry-based design. There is no such thing as timeless architecture. There just isn't, because ministry is shifting and changing so fast that timeless architecture really comes down to thinking about how do we make the architecture flexible and alterable over time to shift with the changing nature of ministry. Well, how do we do that? I have no idea what the next trend is, or what the next situation is going to be for ministry. I could not have predicted where things, 20 years ago were going to go in the next 20 years. So, in any event, my background is in architectural training. I have an undergraduate degree in English literature. In case that bombed on me, in case architecture didn't pan out, I was going to go do something with English. But I finished up in architecture in 1982 and immediately went into this progressive field that really teaches us that architecture really is all about the great art product that comes out of the mind of the architect. And so the phrase in college that I remember was, architecture would be a great field if it wasn't for the client, which is you, by the way. The client is the necessary component to fund the project, to fulfill my artistic endeavors. That's the way I was trained. And I ran my practice that way, as most architects do. If you go into an architectural office, it is replete, if they're doing their job right, it's replete with awards and aspects that portray what great designers they are on the walls of their office. And sometimes it can get a little bit carried away. Architects tend to think that way because, again, we tend to identify what it is that we do as creators of objects in the built environment with our own identities. We start to think that way. And it leads to all kinds of confrontational aspects. Architects are also trained in the idea that that architects are the trusted advisor to the owner, that you're to look upon us as the one that's going to lead and guide the process. The problem is, we're just not very good cost estimators. We're just not trained in that. We're not trained in construction either, by the way. When we get involved in school, I remember taking a construction course to train us in construction that met for one semester at 7:45 in the morning. I was barely alive at 7:45 in the morning. And Ranch Kimball, my architectural construction professor, taught us next to nothing in 6 months of going through this semester training on architectural construction. We just didn't know much about it. And it frankly wasn't emphasized. What was emphasized was design. You know, design your little hearts away with absolute disregard to budget, because the professors had no idea about budget either. So we got out of school and we would go into situations where we would design, and budget was not part of our training. And so when owners would say, oh, we want this, we want that, we want this, the natural response was to be responsive to the owner's demands or ideas. And most contracts are set up, by the way, with architects on a percentage of the cost of construction. So you're thinking, well, they're adding more and more scope and they're doing this and this and this. They must know where the money's coming from. And so architects end up 10 miles down the road on these projects and get themselves into trouble. And for that reason, contractors back in the 90s sort of more and more took positions in the marketplace as the surrogate trusted advisors to the project, because the architects had pretty much failed in that regard. They just hadn't really been very attentive, especially in expanding marketplaces. So anyway, that's my background. I come from that. Solid design can do design just about anything. I worked in the performing arts world for 20 years, and performing arts is one of those last bastions where they really do want you to be creative. You know, everybody wants you to be creative. They just don't want you to spend any money. You know, yeah. So creativity is great, but there's a cost to some people's interpretation of creative. I've noticed that in ministry, we need to term creativity as simplicity. Simple is creative. Simple is good. Simple is beautiful. And simple is beautiful, by the way. I do believe that. So, back in the mid-90s, my head was turned around a little bit. I had an office that I opened in 1988 after I finished my internship and worked for a few years out in the marketplace. I opened my own office and paired up with an older fellow that I was taking some advisement from, and became my partner. I had 25 architects working in my office. We were an expanding firm in the state of Utah. I don't know if you've been to Utah, but it's, at that time, and probably still is considered to be, like people from Ohio consider it to be the last frontier. We're out there on the edge. But there's a little bit of civilization out there. But for the most part, you know, at that point in time, we were an expanding firm. Things were going good. My partner, we had another partner in the firm that was doing sports planning work. He came out of HOK Sports out of Kansas City, doing community centers, which we're going to spend a little time talking about community centers this morning. We were doing planning work for the 2002 Olympics, expanding office, going places, you know, just really launching. And at that point in time, I met an individual, another architect from Ogden, Utah. Matt's already introduced BGW as being from Ogden, Utah. Ogden, Utah is a railroad town. It's Sin City as far as we're concerned down in Salt Lake. Ogden is a place where the Gentiles went. And that's literally what they call non-LDS people in Utah, is I'm a Gentile. In fact, there's a road, a major road that I cross under to get to my office called Gentile Lane. You know, it's not to be mistaken for Gentle Lane, it's Gentile Lane. That's where I come from. So, in any event, I met an individual who was an architect whose purpose in wanting to come down to Salt Lake and meet me was to give me all of his clients. I met this fellow through a relationship that I had at my own church. I attend an evangelical free church. You guys have free churches around here? It's a denomination out of Minnesota, Swedish, Danish organization that came to the United States to flee government intrusion into whatever was happening at the time. I know 1% of the history of all that, but in any event, I had this relationship to this fellow that worked in this other architect's office, and this guy came marching into my office one day to pass along his clients to me, which I was very intrigued by. You know, free clients, boy, that's cool. So this guy came in, and he said, I want to know a little bit about you and your firm and what you do here and what your philosophy is. I didn't really have a philosophy. It was get projects and get them done and make money. I mean, that was my philosophy. And so he said, well, I really want to pass these along. I said, why are you doing this? What's your basis? I figured he was dying of cancer, something along those lines, and he needed some residual income for his family, because if he was like most architects, he hadn't saved a penny. Architects are not really fiscally built that way. So he said, well, here's the deal, is I spent the last year, I took a year off of my practice, and he happened to be an architect who had a general contractor's license. So there was this, in my mind, you know, the evil empire built into one guy. You know, here he was, this architect contractor, and I was used to doing battle with contractors, and here he was, you know, in the same individual. He said, I took a year off, I acted as the contractor and the architect and so on and so forth on a job site that we got some land donated, and we got a Christian school built in Ogden. Christian schools, by the way, in Utah are important because in Utah, all the public schools in junior high and senior high have seminaries for the LDS Church built on adjacent land, and they build into their schedules religion classes, and the LDS kids drag their non-LDS friends to these classes for some you know, activities and so on and so forth. And so for those that are concerned for their kids' education, oftentimes we're looking for alternatives for schools. He said, anyway, I took a year off and I went out and I got this project built. We built 42,000 square feet and got it built, you know, for 15% of what a building ought to cost, because he got everything donated. Everything was, he had the gift, I could tell, because he in 5 minutes you could tell from this guy, he had the ability to stand in front of you and ask you for what he needed from you. That is a gift, by the way. He felt emboldened. He was a man of prayer, and he really felt that he needed to do that. And the community responded, and they got this school built for pennies on the dollar. And so he said, I think we can do a really great job of transitioning this nation out of some of the problems that we're headed towards. If we can just get Christian education re-energized in this nation. And I'm going to go do that. And that was very missional, you know. He had a vision that he was following. And I thought, okay, well, he'll starve to death in 6 months and he'll come back for his clients, because he's not going to make a living doing Christian schools. I have done a couple of Christian schools, and they are not profitable projects. It doesn't work that way. And so, in any event, off he went. I wished him well. He did introduce me to several of his clients, one of whom I did. They were financial institutions. I did probably just under 100 of their branches. I did 300,000 square feet of their corporate building, alongside all the other work that we did. So we had a burgeoning, expanding office. This fellow went off into the distance, and 3 years later, I caught up to him through a newspaper article in the Salt Lake Tribune. He had completed a church for Calvary Baptist Church in downtown Salt Lake City, one of only 2 African-American churches at the time that existed in the state of Utah. Pretty homogenous society in the state of Utah. We're just not that, at the time, we're not that diverse. Things have changed a little bit since then. But the pastor was telling the story about getting this project built. The project was budgeted for $4 million. $4 million in 1998, that was a lot of money. It was designed actually in 96. He said, we got it designed in 96, beautiful design, wonderful design. Designed by a classmate of mine that I was really familiar with, a fellow by the name of Sean. And Sean had designed a beautiful building, got the drawings finished, put them out to bid, bids came back, $4 million budget, $7.5 million bid. So, the architect's answer to that, you haven't done a very good job raising money. You need to raise more money. Don't ask me to change my idea, because this is what we've come up with to respond to your congregation's needs here. I mean, it was a beautiful building. It had these beautiful curving masonry walls that went up. And like a lot of church buildings, load-bearing masonry walls, built very inflexibly. I've done a dozen buildings that way for churches, because that's the way that we used to design, is institutionally, right? Iconically, beautiful buildings that were fixed to last the test of time. And so, beautiful design. I'd seen the model, was familiar with the design. It was kind of a pretty overt public project. And the answer was raise more money, raise more money, raise more money. And so for 3 years, Pastor Franz Davis says, we tried to raise money for 3 years. We couldn't ever really get there. And finally we found this firm up in Ogden that came in and built a building for us, added 1,000 square feet, and got it built for the original budget. And we couldn't be more happy to be celebrating the opening of this building. And so the building was built in an inner portion of a large super block that Salt Lake City has. I was not familiar with the site, so I drove over to see it. I expected to see a El Cheapo building, you know, one of these buildings where everything is just really done on the cheap. You know, metal wall panel, cheap carpet, cheap doors, frames, hardware. And I went into the building, it was open, there was nobody in the building. I walked right through the front doors, the doors were open. I walked in, beautiful gymnasium, terrific worship space, great spaces, I couldn't believe it. And they got it built for 20–30% under what I was used to seeing for projects of this nature. And so during the course of reading that article, the pastor said we came upon a company in Ogden named Building God's Way. And then the name of the individual that had passed his clients on to me was associated with that, Dan. And I thought, oh my gosh, who would name their company Building God's Way? Who would do that? He's gone off the deep end. He thinks he has some special dispensation from God. Now, I'd been to his office before, you know, briefly, and I knew he did not have a wall of awards. You know, he didn't have all the things that the normal architect would have. He was more of a contractor than he was an architect. He just happened to have an architectural license while he pursued a lot of the contracting work that he was doing. And so I knew him as a mediocre designer. And here he is naming his company Building God's Way. And I thought, oh my gosh, what kind of marketing plan is that? And so I didn't know him well enough to call him up and go after him on the telephone. So I just sort of held it in. And I brought the newspaper article in to talk to some of the staff in my office and asked them, what do you guys know about Building God's Way out of Ogden? Nobody knew anything. And so I just sort of let it go and ran into him at a conference that I was the incoming president for the State American Institute of Architects 1 year or 2 years. And it was my job to host the state conference, organize speakers, put topics together with a small committee of people, and have all the firm owners and registered architects come in for this training and so on and so forth. And this fellow, Dan, showed up to the conference and forms a relationship in the first 10 minutes of the keynote opening remarks to Scott Simpson from Cambridge, Massachusetts, my keynote speaker, forms a relationship through a real quick Q&A that happened from the podium. And they arranged lunch over the top of the podium stand. I don't even remember what the questions were, but he gave them some provocative answer, and anyway, they said, hey, can I maybe share more with you at lunch today? And they formed lunch. So after he finished speaking, Dan pops up on the stage and says, hey, I haven't seen you for a few years. I want to show you what we're doing, but why don't you join us for lunch today? And all I'm thinking is, this is the guy that's named his company Building God's Way. Flee, Will Robinson, flee. Right? I didn't want any part of that. So I gave him some, answer, begged off lunch. I had vendors to take care of and so forth as the host for the conference, and so I didn't pursue lunch with him. And after lunch, he caught me and he said, hey, how about coming up to Ogden and seeing what you're doing? He might as well have said, why don't you catch a spaceship to the moon? I was not going to drive to Ogden. So I gave him the standard 2-week answer that people give universally across cultures. If you don't want to do something, you just tell them 2 weeks, because that's how long it takes the human mind to forget that they ever asked the question to begin with. Yeah, can we do that in 2 weeks? You're off the hook. 9 times out of 10. Well, in 2 weeks I get a phone call. Hey, we're going to get together this week. Yeah. Okay, so I did the 2-week thing for 6 weeks. The conference was in the beginning of October, and finally I ended up, to get them off my back, I had to show up to the office at the beginning of December in 2002, I remember that. And I assumed that it was Dan and my friend Brian, who was a mechanical engineer that worked for him as an engineer and a drafter, and Daryl and his other brother, Daryl, in the back room, working on projects. Because Dan was you know, he was from Ogden. I mean, what's going to come out of Ogden? And so, anyway, I walked into a situation where, first of all, he was in a warehouse, which was really weird. You know, there was no really cool office space. Architects like to have cool offices. This was anti-cool. This was not cool at all. And I walked in, and he had double my staff. I had 25 architects. He had 50 people crammed into a space that shouldn't have. You know, if the fire marshal would have figured out what was going on in that building, you know, trouble. And he had double my staff. He had 10 times the work that I was doing. He had work in 36 states around the nation. And I mean, this is a guy that really did come from working in the basement of his garage with Brian and Daryl, and went to a situation where he had double my staff in about 6 years. And so I couldn't believe it. And I wasn't quite sure how to resolve all that. I remember going up there thinking that I could get out of there in 45 minutes if I was disciplined about, you know, shaking hands and kissing babies and leaving the room. And I ended up spending about 6 hours that day up there with him, and saw some very different things that I was not used to seeing. Now here I was, the president of the American Institute of Architects, and thought I had the finger on everything that was happening in the state. And I was seeing a process of putting things together and doing things that was very different. It was not to be confused with the two main forms of contract that I had operated under: design, bid, build, where the architect hires the architect and goes through a sequential process to eventually get the contractor involved, or design, build, where the architect and the contractor form one contract. It was neither of those. But he was getting buildings built, and he was getting them built for far less money than what I was seeing, and he wasn't doing it by scrimping on the kinds of systems and materials that were going in. And so there was a lot of questions that were developed that day on my part. At the end of the day, we sat down, and Dan said, so, you know, how things are going for you? And I said, well, they're just busting. You know, we get all kinds of work, and we're doing all kinds of things. And he said, well, how would you like to just stop doing that and come join me? And I said, no. Have you seen what we've built? I mean, you know, in my mind I'm thinking, you haven't really spent much time in my conference room looking at all my awards, have you? You don't know about my reputation, do you? And he was saying, yeah, okay, well, that's great, but what does that matter? You know, what is that? And that was a little tough to hear, you know. But he didn't say it that way. I mean, he was a little bit more diplomatic. Not much more. He's not a very diplomatic person. He's retired now, so he's less diplomatic. But he said, yeah, I think that this could be a great partnership if you bring some of your folks over and help me. He had a tiger by the tail. He had more work than he could possibly get done. And he just needed people that were competent people to get work churned out, get it over with, and get it through. And so I said, no, I'm not really ready to make that commitment, Dan. I said, I'm struggling with the name Building God's Way. Why did you name your company Building God's Way? And he said, you know, he was kind of taken aback a little bit, amused by the question. And he said, it really doesn't really have anything to do with us. You know, we're not you know, any special gifted designers. And I'm thinking, yeah, no kidding. We are, you know, in a situation where we're working on projects for ministry groups, and we have to be attentive to stewardship. Not stewardship in the way that architects like to talk about stewardship in terms of thinking green, or following the LEAD principles, which is a leadership enterprise organization that does things. Not in those terms, but yes in those terms. But above and beyond that, the resources that are committed by individuals who are giving to these projects, and you know, the faithfulness that they're going through in order to provide money. We have to be thinking hard about the initial cost of the building, but we also have to think about the long-term cost of the building, the kinds of systems that we use, the kinds of materials that are executed in a project. Because I mean, you can spend a lot of money on floor selection, or a little bit of money on floor selection, and totally implode yourself on the maintenance of that floor. And so he was talking about things that architects don't oftentimes think about, which is replacement values and those kinds of things. And he was thinking in different terms, trying to not put ministries into situations that they oftentimes find themselves where they become slaves of buildings. You know, even buildings that are like historical properties where you're with anything you can find, bubble gum and baling wire, trying to keep that building up and going, and you become a slave to a building in a community that has expectations that you're going to make sure that it's done and kept in a proper situation, and you're just committing more and more of your budget resources and so on and so forth. And he said, you know, congregations, frankly, they should be ministering the gospel, not becoming, the church is not the building, is essentially what he was saying. And so he was really de-emphasizing, you know, what I was taught was that you become established in a community as a church, and then you build a building, and that becomes your presence. You know, that becomes who you are. He was talking anti that. And he said, so I think on the stewardship side, we could do a lot better job having more frank discussions with people about stewardship and what that really implies. And on the ministry side, Dan accepted Christ in 1986, and he retired and older than I am now, so he'd been practicing for a number of years. He said, I probably worked on 100 ministry-based projects prior to that period of time. Not one single time did anybody from any church ever share Christ with me. He said, churches are tough, really tough, because they get a project going. You know, the pastor's involved peripherally in the very beginning to get the concepts taken care of, and then they turn it over to the COG, the cranky old guy. And the cranky old guy comes in. Who is that? Is that one of you guys? Did I say? Okay. All right. They're in every meeting. I'm telling you. I'm one now. I'm the cranky old guy in my own church. You know, so these are folks that know the trades, they know the process, they know the war, and they come in on behalf of the pastor, which is an excellent idea, and they ride roughshod over everything and every aspect of the project in order, and that's their definition of stewardship, is we just trample on relationships to get what we need because that's what we need. God will justify that. You know, it's just tough. I've worked with a lot of them. And we sort of have to gently say, hey, instead of coming over and I remember a union contractor in Chantilly, Virginia, a union plumber coming on the job who happened to have a leadership position in the church and just doing damage on that job site with relationships. And we just said, hey, you know, AJ, you gotta come alongside people. You can't talk to people in these terms. Well, that's the way things work on a job site. I know, but not on these job sites. We're going to do things differently here. He said, frankly, I think on a ministry side, we can do a better job of coming alongside people. And he talked about the story on the school project that he had done. He said, you know, during that job, we made sure that when people delivered something to the job site or when they came to work on the job site, we made sure that we, you know, started out finding out who they were, what their name was, welcoming them, asking them to come in and share a meal with us in the job trailer. You know, we had sandwiches brought in and we would get to know them, and if they didn't have time, we would, you know, give them a coupon to a McDonald's or something like that, you know. Something connected to food. People, contractors, by the way, respond to food. Food is the thing that really works in a lot of situations. And so, in any event, he said we had 10 fellows that were Mormons come in and accept Christ on that job site. And so, in our world, that's a pretty big decision for a person to make because their families are taken away from them at that point. And so, I've met one or two of the fellows that were on that job site. Used to work with Bob Furstenmill, one of the contractors that I worked with, and was quite impressed that through a job they had come to know Christ. And so, in any event, my head was sort of turned around with that answer. I sent a couple of my fellows up to his office for a month to train underneath him. They would come back and download information to my staff. Over the course of 2003, we made the decision to unplug, to stop my previous firm, EMA, and I joined Dan in partnership. Immediately, half of my staff quit. They went to work for Craig Elliott, who had been my partner from HOK Sports. Craig took an office out to Park City for a sports planning firm, and half my staff went up there with him because they had no intention of working for a company called Building God's Way. I didn't have the time to express what that meant. They didn't care. It didn't matter. That was where God was leading them for whatever reason. And so at the end of the day, we joined in, and since that time, we have had the privilege of working with ministerial groups all over the nation and have learned, if there's one thing BGW is that we are a learning organization. We learn from the best and we learn from the worst. We see all kinds of troubled situations. We get involved in all kinds of projects, and we are taking notes as fast as we can. And fortunately, I work in an industry or a field or a genre where people want to share success so that the next group can succeed as well as they are. Nobody's hiding their best stuff. They're saying, this is what's worked. But the reality of it is that it all works differently in different communities. What works for one group in Fort Myers, Florida, isn't going to work in Casper, Wyoming. It's a different approach, it's a different mindset, it's a different way of thinking, or culture. But we've learned a lot about where things are headed, what works, what doesn't work for different groups, and been able to bring ideas. And we're constantly changing, and it constantly reinforces the need for us to be talking about flexibility. Flexibility is crucially important, and as is cost and all the things that go along with stewardship. So this morning, I'm going to sort of refocus here and talk about some of those things that we've learned. What are some of the things that are happening out there? And how does architecture play a role? The reason Matt got up here and talked, Matt and I travel and do these things, and every time I sit down and hear Matt talk, new thoughts emerge in my mind, new things, new rededication to the purpose of why we're doing this. Why are we building buildings? It's hopefully not for the honor and glory of some building committee or some pastor or some congregation. But these buildings are being built as tools to the honor and glory of Christ. Right? Christ He's our light. And these buildings have to be able to reflect that and be used as tools in order to reflect that to a community. And so that's why we're doing this. That's why we're in this. That's why we align ourselves with like-minded people who are builders, who can be treated as trusted advisors. I'll get into the intricacies of that relationship later on, but when you've got an architect and a contractor and an owner who get that right, who are willing to put the Lord in the center of that relationship, some amazing things can happen. You will have challenges, I guarantee you that. Budget, code, whatever, they come along. That's just the nature of the beast here. But this can be a very profitable way to move forward, not monetarily, but profitable in terms of what it can do for a congregation to arm them with facilities and tools to move forward. So we're going to talk about some of those things this morning. We're going to talk about different ways to think about buildings, changing our perspective about buildings. That's an important component, getting out of the mindset that we get our building built because that's the church that we are. And so we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about developing vision. How do we develop vision? How does that happen? It doesn't happen with me. Churches all the time, they say, you've had a lot of experience. You've designed over 800 plus ministry projects. Give us a vision. I don't know. I don't know what your vision is. You tell me. And we'll talk about vision. We'll get down the road on that, but we'll talk about how to develop vision. Creating partnerships that matter. Partnerships are crucial. Relationship is crucial. So doing that in a way that really makes sense is important, and we're going to talk about collaboration and how collaboration can help too. So, okay, so let's spend a few minutes and talk about changing our perspectives about buildings. What we would say, moving from community or consumer-centered design to community-centered design. I mentioned that a few minutes ago that Craig, my previous partner, had done community centers. What's the difference between that? It's funny, you look back at the way that buildings that were dedicated for certain ministerial reasons were built back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and 70s and so on and so forth. They were built iconically. They were built for that. By that statement, what I mean is that a building was built in a form and in a substance to look like a church, to be reflective of what that community felt like a church ought to look like, right? So, you go to the southeast. A classic example is the gable building with the 4 columns. We actually presented in a family life center yesterday at a church that was exactly that building in Kentucky, you know. Gable, 4 columns. You know what the younger fellows in my office call that? Phony cologne. So to them, it's not authentic, it's not real. It's iconic, though. No mistaking that building for what it was. You drive by that building in Middletown, Kentucky, you drive by that building and boom, that's a church. I know a church when I see a church, right? So, designed that way. Well, there's been a fleeing of iconic form by today's society for whatever reason. There's been a mistrust of that. So it's changed about those ways of thinking. More towards community-centered design, too. And community-centered design, the parallel is interesting. You know, I was born in *57. I grew up in the '60s, you know, starting to go to the YMCA's to play ball with my friends on Saturday afternoon. We had a YMCA down the road in Chicago where I was raised. And the YMCA was built in the way that churches were built back in those days, very institutional, very sequential. Churches were built sequentially because they would need a place to worship, then they would add a narthex, then they would maybe tack on a couple of bathrooms so they didn't have to go to the outhouse, and then they would go tack on a children's wing or an adult education wing or a family life center or an administration area or this, that, and the other thing. And pretty soon you had these buildings, as they would acquire property and add on, they had these buildings that were maze-like buildings. You would go into these buildings and the usher would greet you and shake your hand and tell you where to hang up your coat and hand you a bulletin and then hand you a guide map and tell you, good luck to you. We may never see you again. You're going to need to drop your kids off over here on the guide map. If you get lost, just go out the door and walk around the building and come to the front because you're never going to find your way back through the building again. That's the way buildings were built, and it didn't matter 40 years ago. Because people didn't make decisions about where to go to church based on these external issues of spatial organization or functional layout. They made decisions on where to go to church based on what? Where they were raised. I was raised in this church, I moved to this town, I'm going to that church. Denominational decisions made that easy. Well, churches have changed. People think differently. Everybody's become a shopper. Everybody thinks differently, right? There's criteria now that people have. Who could have predicted that safety for children was going to be an issue? You know, when my kids were being raised from '83 to whenever they left home, actually one's still in the house. But when my kids were raised, you know, they would get out of the car and just disappear. They knew where their friends were, they knew where their class was, boom, gone. Nowadays, parents don't do that. They clutch their kids, they hold their kids, they bring their kids to a check-in point. They make sure that the criteria that the people that are responsible for their kids need to hear are heard loudly and clearly so that there's no mistaking what my goals are for my kids. People think differently about that kind of thing. So the way that we navigate buildings is different. The way that parents and kids move through buildings, the way that we circulate, the way that we relate to spaces differently. It's all very different. So this whole notion of community-centered design has transitioned from the old YMCA's of the past where you would go into a building and you would pay your money and then you would go down the hall and you would find the tag that said men's locker room and you go in the locker room and then you weave your way through the locker room and then you find the gym or you find the pool buried back in the bowels of the building, right? That's the way the old Ys were. Well, modern community centers are not built that way at all. Modern community centers, lots of glass, not institutional, open, inviting, perceivable. You can see inside the building, right? Our churches of the past, you can't see inside the churches of the past. They're closed off. They're fortress-like. We do a lot of these buildings, by the way, a lot of transition buildings. We're working on one in Boulder, Colorado right now that is right in the heart of downtown Boulder. That land must be worth $25 million that they're sitting on. And they had a decision process. Do we abandon this land and abandon this building and sell the land and go out and build what we need on a beautiful piece of land in the suburbs? Or do we stay here? Their vision is surprise Boulder. Surprise Boulder with what? Surprise Boulder with the gospel. We're staying here. We've been here for 100 years. We're not leaving. Well, we got a fortress. Help us transition the fortress into something that is open. Take us from the YMCA to the community center of the modern day, which is clear entry, lots of glass, color. It's okay to use color in church. Color, by the way, is one of those things that really helps define a sense of relevancy. And color is free. It's free. I can't wait to go to heaven. I hear there's really cool things that he's done with color. I mean, not in the way that we think about color, you know? So, color is one of those things we can utilize as a tool. And so, it's important for us to think about the way that space is organized. When you go into a modern community center, everything is there. Pool, gym, concession stand, climbing wall. Boom, everything is right there. Glass, everything is visible. Everything, you can see fun happening. You can see exercise happening. You can see the people in the weight room. That's different than the YMCA, sequentially designed. Church, sequentially designed. So, difference. That's a different way of thinking. Matt used the example of the woman at the well, because the well was the community center, right? It was where people gathered in the center of the community. It's what they needed to do every single day. I learned that in 1988 when I first opened my office. I got a contract to do inspections to prepare all the USPS facilities in the western United States for the changing ADA codes that would come along in a year or two. So I got to go out and inspect post offices in places like Troy, Montana, and what were some of the towns in Wyoming? I don't even remember. They, you know, Sheepskin, Wyoming. I mean, it was just these little communities that were nothing communities, but they all had a post office. And I learned pretty quickly that at 10 o'clock, when the postmaster, or 11 o'clock, whenever the postmaster got around to it, would put the mail in the slot, the town showed up. And the town showed up at that time not just to go retrieve their mail, the town showed up to connect with one another. They knew that if they showed up at 10 o'clock, they were going to see so-and-so and so-and-so, and catch up on this and catch up on that. It was the town hub. It was the well. Well, how do we think about our churches as that integral to our communities? How do we think about that? Is our building prepared to be able to become a place where people come to? I learned this in Chula Vista, California. This is one of those learning experiences that we had. We're doing the second phase of their project right now, where we did the first phase 11 years ago. It took them 4 years to go through the process of getting their building built in California. And the majority of that is negotiating the community betterments that you have to give to the city in order to get them to approve your project. Everything is done under conditional use. And in order to get their project approved, they had to go build hiking paths across town on their nickel to be able to get it. So it's just an extortion process that California has figured out. So it took them 4 years to get it done. They got it done, and right off the bat, they started getting requests for, can we have our yoga exercise class here? Can we have our cheer class? Can we have our taekwondo class? Can we do this? Can we do that? And their answer was, no, we're not really set up to do that. We can't really, you know, we have our staff here, and we don't really have volunteers to lock and unlock the building at night. We really can't do that. But there was obviously a need. So that summer, after they opened up in the fall, that next summer, they had a couple of interns coming in. The intern's job was, you connect with the people that need the space, and you control the keys and lock it up and replenish the paper towels. And so these interns did that, and within a year, they had 1,200 people a week coming into their building that were not members of their church. They weren't connecting, though. It's really nice to create people flow. We're going to talk about creating people flow. They were not connecting. So a couple of the older folks in the church became hip to this, and they started a parenting class on Saturday mornings and started passing flyers out about coming to a free parenting class. Well, these moms that were coming in for these yoga exercise classes, trying to get their bodies in shape after having small children, after having babies, they were taking them up on it, and they started coming to these classes and forming a relationship to the older people. It's why I stuck in the church that I am in now for 40 plus years, is because of Eunice Bellamy and Dorothy Ernst in 1977, when I followed a girl into church. After she dumped me, Eunice and Dorothy in their 70s started feeding us college students pork chops. Come over after church and have pork chop dinners with us. We were college students. We were eating hot dogs and ragu for dinner all week. And they were feeding us mashed potatoes, not instant mashed potatoes. They had instant mashed potatoes in 1977. Corn, not canned corn. Corn, gravy. You know, this was like real home cooking. And Dorothy and Eunice figured out, they didn't have much to say to us. We're so glad to have young people in the church. Stuff that was really gracious and cool to hear, but they were just feeding us good food. Like these older people at this church in Chula Vista, they were just being gracious to people coming in and saying, let us tell you about our experiences raising our kids. And boom, the young marriage class takes off in this church. They had become a de facto community center. Right? They figured out how to connect to community after the people flow started to happen. People are coming in. You're not going to go out and knock on doors in America anymore and hand them a tract and get them to come to your church. I did that in Cuba in 2004. People were hungrily receiving the information you could give them. Tract ministries, alive and well in Cuba. That doesn't work in the United States. People we're savvy to that. They're guarded. So how do you do it? You establish a relationship. Bring them into your building. Figure out what kind of facility can we create, and what kind of need can we create to answer. How can we become that well? What kind of story does your building tell? It's going to tell a story. It's going to communicate something, positive or negative or mediocre or whatever it is, to the surrounding community. Is it a building that people, as Matt was saying earlier, drive by and go, hey, there's something going on in there. What is going on in there? I can see something happening in that building. Right? Important to think about how that happens. Does your building communicate that you want to be part of the community, or is it oppositional to that form of thinking? Are you in a facility that is closed and guarded and walled off? Again, load-bearing walls, punched openings, shutters, big gigantic doors. The classic church, classic definition of church. Or does it communicate something different? Well, a lot of this starts with this whole discussion of mission, and how do we get to mission? How does that happen? Mission is hopefully derived from thoughtful prayer. I guess the word today is mindful. Mindful. I mock that word sometimes, but I really think that being thoughtful and intentional about praying for mission is very important, and doing it in a group, doing it with people, because mission doesn't always come from just one person. It comes from a lot of people. How do we do that? How do we identify the greatest needs in the community? People will say, you worked all over the United States. Tell us what the needs are around here. I have no idea. I was down in South Florida, and they were saying, we've got X amount of money sitting in the bank here. We want to go out and plant the campus out in Immokalee, Florida. We want to do a child care center out there and make it our initial implant in the community. Well, it turns out they didn't need a child care center out there. There's no kids out there. Well, there's a lot of older folks, or immigrants that were coming in. There were needs that were related to some of the Haitian immigrants that were coming in, but there wasn't child care. So, what are the needs? How do we get to finding out what the needs are? For a number of years, for 9 years, I chaired an organization called Assist in Salt Lake City. And Assist had a outreach to the communities using community development block grants derived from the federal government administered through the cities. And in order for the cities to get CBDG money from the federal government, and it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars every year that they would get, we would use that money to put up emergency ramps for people who were below the poverty line, widen doors, put grab bars in to make buildings accessible so that residents could stay in their buildings for as long as possible while they were either going through a healing situation or whether they had aged or whatever it was. Well, in order to do that, the communities had to put together assessment forms that are used by the federal government to do that. They have those. You can go to those cities and become familiar with what the results of those assessments say. Go and ask them for those. Ask them, how do you guys, the studies that you guys do for the federal government to get CBDG monies, can we have copies of those and read those? They will tell you what their biggest needs are. Find those things out. That's beginning points for understanding who your community really is, not who you think they are. Everybody wants to start a food kitchen. In a lot of communities today, food is a done deal. They don't need to worry about food. It's been taken care of. Last year, I remember organizations in Utah handing turkeys out to anybody that would take them because they were going to all go bad because there weren't enough families that needed turkeys. That's not where the needs were. The needs were in other areas. There were needs in our communities, whether they be opioid related or whether they be related to the education system being swamped and overwhelmed or abuse situations, whatever it is. Find out what those needs are and figure out how to connect to that. Developing a vision for the future. What are some of the ways that we can begin to think about creating people flow? The two top ones on this list of child care and senior care ministry organizations are automatically given a hall pass on this. They automatically trust you on this. A lot of churches have done child care, and they will say, we are never doing child care again. We are never doing pre-K again. Because they've done it the wrong way. They've done pre-K in a way that is not the way that a business model would follow to get at competent, profitable, financially stable child care. They do a pretty good job on the ministry side in some regards, although my kids went to a pre-K at a church 2 blocks from where we lived in Salt Lake City. We were a one-car family back in the 80s. For 9 years my kids went to that school as they progressed through in ages, and not one single time did that church ever connect to us, to ask us to come to a church-related event. They were nice people. They did a competent job of caring for our children and teaching our kids some things and allowing my wife to have a break. But at the end of the day, there was no cross-connection. There was no intentionality behind that. So they failed in 2 regards. They were failing financially. I learned that later on because I did an addition to their building as an architect, and I realized what a millstone this pre-K center was for this church financially. And they didn't form connection to the neighborhood. Why are you doing this? Because in their mind, they thought, well, this is what ministry groups do. We do this. Yeah, but you're not doing it for any reason other than you think you should be doing it. So there's ways of doing this. We're going to talk about this morning. Connection points through the performing arts. I can sit up here and tell you stories about organizations that have done an excellent job with performing arts and connecting to community through that. Community event spaces. The Hub 801 that you saw, Matt's Church operated a community event space that was a money resource to help them through the early stages of affording that mortgage that they had on that building. Athletics and fitness, shared workspace. I'll show you some examples of that kind of stuff. Make sure that when you do this, though, that you're following the guidelines of a good master plan. That's where we get ourselves into trouble in a lot of projects, is the master plan consisted of whomever was in charge of the trustee board at the time going out and buying a piece of land and tacking on the next addition. Oh, we need this? Okay, let's go buy so-and-so's house back here and tear the house down and build this, or convert the house to that, or build around the house. That was the master plan, is that as needs would present themselves, we would go out and find land adjacent to our building and just tack on another addition. And you had these, again, these maze-like buildings, sequential buildings. Master planning is important, and it is important, if not to you, it'll be important for your community. Be careful with a master plan and your community. Communities will try to box you in on decisions that you have no idea about 20 years from now. Be careful. Don't sign agreements on master plans that don't allow you some flexibility on your master plan. Make sure that you have things written in on your master plan when you sign these SPA agreements, these special provision agreements and so forth, that allow you some flexibility. So if things change, you can reorganize the way that you do this. It's important to think about flexibility in a master plan. Think about phasing, too. I can't tell you how many times, I get the financial analysis back from the organization that we work with to do financial research before we go out and do a design charrette, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I find out that their needs are X, but their budget is 1/3 of X. We're going to phase portions of this project. Let's start talking about prioritization. How do we do this? And how do we do it in such a way that if we're going to phase it, that when the next phase comes along, we don't stymie your organization by the intrusion of a construction project right in the heart of what you're trying to get done. So thinking logically about how is the way that we add on going to affect the functional layout of space is going to be important. It's just good stewardship, by the way. It's a project that we're involved in. You're going to hear from Bill Shalkowski this morning. Bill is with the Solomon Foundation. He's behind this project. This is a project that is done in Escondido. It's New Vintage Church. They're connecting into arts organizations. They're resurrecting an old 600-seat theater, tacking on about 20,000 square feet next to this, and using the arts as an entry point into their community. So 6 days a week they're going to be having arts events here, arts training, arts presentations, arts, visual arts, so on and so forth, performing arts in this building. But they are a church that happens to have a building that's dedicated to the arts. And the arts, by the way, are one of those communities that don't oftentimes get a chance to hear the gospel. They become alienated to the gospel. Artists and art people coming from that culture are oftentimes living on a different planet. I am one of those people, by the way. New Vintage Church, Grand Theater, that's what they're gonna call it. Brookhaven Church, this is a church that was dead in the water until they employed an organization that we're affiliated with to come in and run and manage their pre-K center. So we opened a pre-K center. It's a pre-K center that will eventually take on 260 kids. They've been open for 13 months. The total project was $7.2 million. The entire mortgage on the project, they had $2 million in cash, so they had a $5+ million mortgage. The entire mortgage is covered by the proceeds from the pre-K. Okay? That's a big deal. That's what enabled this project to get built. And in that period of time, they've been in for 13 months, they've doubled the size of their congregation. And they are connecting, they're not managing the pre-K center, it's being managed by an outside organization that does this for a living. I mean, it's their goal in life is to manage pre-K centers. They split the profits, there's a 60-40 split of some sort in this deal, and they manage it in a proper way. The church still scholarships some of the parents that have needs for pre-K. They scholarship them out of the proceeds that come in from this. But this is a legit pre-K center. And by the way, it's top drawer kid space, which has been one of the strong attractors for young families in McKinney, Texas to this church, because they have the best of the best when it comes to the kinds of space that they have for their kids. So terrific space and really serving the needs of the community. And now the church has taken off because they were intentional about forming a relationship to the flow of people that would come into that building, that do come into that building every day. Just last month, I heard Nelson Eagle, who's one of the managers of this organization, said that last month they turned a check for the month of September for $50,000 to the church. And that was the plan, $55,000 a month. So they're within $5,000 of their target in 1 year. Hub 757 has done the same thing. We're now working on the second phase of their pre-K. Their 220 student pre-K was so successful, we're building a duplicate across the street. They also operate a 1,000-seat performing arts center that is used as their church. So these are organizations that are inviting the community to come in and then intentionally thinking about how do we get in their path on the flow of people that come in, how do we do that? This is Believers Church in Suffolk, Virginia, down in Hampton Roads. And it's great space. It's good space. Everybody wins in this deal. So, other examples, the Salt Mine Project. This is a project for Christian businessmen out of Atlanta, came into Salt Lake City. We are the place that everybody wants to come plant a church because of the LDS culture. They came in, and what they did instead of planting a church is they opened a for-profit 19,000 square foot shared workspace. It has a room about this size that seats about 180 people for training events. It has become a home to plant 2 churches. That was their intention, was to create space that could be double used. Church planting space, and then the other 165 hours a week is used for shared workspace. And now the people from the church are renting space, the staff from the churches are renting space during the midweek to integrate into the path of people who are there for work. So they're forming intentional relationship to the community through that and inviting them into church on Sunday. And it's a cool space. That's the great thing, is you get that kind of thing. This is the church I was talking about, Boulder, Colorado, that has decided we want to open our building up. We want to get away from the fortress mentality. They've got an annex building across the street that's going to have affordable housing. It's going to have a training level for a bakery, and they're exploring now a zero-proof bar. Have you heard of zero-proof bars? So no alcohol, bar environments. I'm telling you, in Boulder, Colorado, this is going to be a hit because they're very health conscious in Boulder, Colorado. Everybody's got an exercise bike strapped onto their back for whatever they're doing. Everybody is that way. And so zero-proof bars, which have taken off in all places, New York City, are now being brought into this situation. And they're using it as training ground for people coming out of homeless situations and so forth. Retail can be incorporated in. Matt will talk a little bit about retail. This is a retail hotel project built onto the property next to First Baptist Church, a leadership training center in Denver, Colorado, that's also used as a church on Sunday mornings. So what you're seeing is the trend here of coupling all these kinds of dual purpose type spaces that can be used to form intrusion into community in an intentional way. Okay? That's how architecture can assist that. Collaboration, we talked about, I've used this word a couple times this morning, doing design by charrette. Has anybody ever participated in a charrette, formal charrette? Okay, so charrette is the French word for little chariot. And they used to roll this little cart through the Beaux-Arts School of Design in Paris, France in the 1700s, and if your drawings weren't on the cart, you received a failing grade. So for architects, it's a big deal to get your drawings done. We do that over a 3-day time period. We invite the church in. There's ways of setting this up in the proper way. Don't just invite the people that can afford to fund the project or the old guys on the leaders board or the ministry leaders in the children's ministry. Invite some younger people into this. Get a mixed group of people. Get some different perspectives. Gain access to their opinions. They will respectfully share their opinions. And it's important to have intergenerational discussions in a lot of different settings like this. So getting the invitations right. Our process happens over a 3-day time period. There is a homework stage that goes on ahead of the charrette. I'm doing one next week in Indiana. I spent some time early this morning working on a few things in preparation for that. We're setting it up properly to understand their existing buildings, to understand their properties, to understand what the city regulations are going to be. All that homework is done ahead of time. There's a financial survey that's done that puts together a report so I understand, where's the limits for this project. Really important to understand. Good architecture happens after we establish where the boundaries really are, and financial is one of those boundaries. So understanding that is going to be very important. We spend the first day talking about needs and vision, and I've got some clue. I've got a call set up with the one I'm doing next week, tomorrow, to go over some of this stuff. I'm looking for things that I think I know, but I'm also looking for things that I definitely don't know. And then we're going to get involved in the discussion at night. That first night is getting everybody on the same page. It's making sure that when I leave that night and I go through that 2 hours of stark raving panic on design, that I've got a clear idea of what our goals are as a group. I want to make sure that I understand how many seats are we doing, or what's the size and scale of the space, what's our first phase look like, so on and so forth. I may use some diagrams like this to get the adjacencies right, whether it's existing space or new space. But that first night is not really about presenting, it's about asking. That second night, though, we'll come in with more defined floor plans, master plan concept ideas, basically to pin up and talk about. And then by the time we get to day 3, we're talking about a much more revised form of things after we get the input of people. Day 2 is an exciting time. It's a momentum building time. People really get involved in that. I mean, it's just a great time to do that. And we're showing them pictures of the way the building will look. We're designing in 3D, so we're able to do that. All of which is subject to change. Architects, like anybody else, they don't like change. I designed something, this is my creation, why are you telling me that you don't like this? Right? Architects in that situation, after they've gone off to their own studios for 3 weeks and they come back and they've invested so much time and energy and thought into the project, and they put it up there on a screen or they put it up there on the boards, and somebody says, yeah, I really like that, and that works out really well, but that's one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen in my life. You know what my job is? How to discredit you. Let me tell you how much you don't understand about architecture. They may do it more subtly, but there's a defensiveness that gets set up. Well, the charrette disarms everybody from that. We're here working together to do this. And a lot of times I like to present up on a whiteboard so people can come up and draw over the top of the design and talk about things that they've seen or talk about things that work better for them so that we do understand. We can change and morph the design as it moves along. So it's not just here, take it, here it is, I've concocted the most wonderful thing. It's a different way of designing. terrifying, but a different way. So finally we get to that process. Eventually we can do more photorealistic renderings or fly-throughs or fly-arounds or however we want to do that. Nowadays with computers, I mean, computers have assisted us so much where we don't have to disappear into the office for weeks at a time and come back. We can come back and have things ready or do things on the fly as we're talking. So some great things can happen with the assistance of some of the tools that we have now. But it's a really great way to get the people around the table and really transition from the ownership of the design from the architect to the body of people that will be employing this and funding this and moving this forward so that they feel like this is ours and I can explain it. I can take it to the other people in the congregation and show them this. So anyway, those are the kinds of things that happen. We're going to spend a little bit of time in our breakout session talking about the process, more about the process. Some things that I just touched on, scratched the surface on a little bit here a few minutes ago that are going to be important for us to convey. The next session that we're going to take together, Matt's going to come back up and lead a session on how to form these strategic relationships with individuals and how to get off the dime. What are the first steps? What do we do? How do we move this forward? And talk about the story call that has been established in order to sort of get that initial step moving forward for you. Sometimes the answer to these things too, by the way, whether they be some of the ideas that you've seen up here, the answer is no, not now. Sometimes people will say, hey, we've got to get this building built. I've had pastors say, we've got to get this building project up and going because I'm having all kinds of trouble with my congregation here. I need a project to rally around. Bad idea. Don't put me in the middle of that. I worked as a student for a couple of my professors, and 3 of the first 5 houses that I designed divorced before we opened the doors of that house. Why? Because they had bad marriages going in. It wasn't that the house project did it. The house project just caused the bad marriage to emerge. It was a bad marriage going in, and they thought that they were going to save the marriage by a house project. Well, churches do the same thing. We just need to do this because that's the root of all our problems. We don't have shared adversity. Don't do that. Go for a hike. Go up and climb a mountain together or something, but don't build a building. Right? So we're gonna talk a little bit about positioning yourself properly to be able to do a project in a way that makes sense, or not do a project. So if the answer is no, hear that, understand. No, not now, or no, not ever. Or ever is a long time, but sometimes the answer is not a building. Sometimes the answer is simpler. Sometimes people want to abandon an area when a simple conversion can be done to a space. We want to help you through that through either the advice of competent builders or architects or some of the other folks that Matt's going to talk about. So let's take another 5-minute break. We'll come back together. Matt and Bill are going to come up and share a few things, and then we'll get to lunch. Thank you.